The rhythmic tap of a rosewood cane against Italian marble was the only sound that held any authority in the cavernous dining hall. It was a sound of deliberate, measured weakness, a performance orchestrated for an audience of vipers. Ryu Oyabun of the Kageyama-gumi sat at the head of a 20-foot-long mahogany table, his eyes, once sharp enough to dissect a man's soul from across a room, now covered by a thin black silk cloth. The official story, whispered in terrified reverence, was that a rival's bomb had stolen his sight, but not his life. The truth was a weapon he kept sheathed. He had orchestrated the accident himself, a calculated sacrifice to lure the rot from the woodwork of his own organization. For 3 months, he had been a ghost in his own empire, listening. Tonight, the vipers were growing bold. Goro, a brute with more muscle than sense, laughed too loudly at one of his own crude jokes. Masato, the clan's accountant, subtly moved a portfolio of financial documents just out of Ryu's theoretical line of sight before discussing them. They were children testing the bars of a lion's cage, forgetting the lion was still inside. Then came the deliberate clumsiness. Hideo, his second-in-command, the man he'd once considered a brother, reached for the decanter of wine. His hand slipped red liquid, dark as blood, splashed across the polished wood, pooling dangerously close to Ryu's silk sleeve. A collective, sharp intake of breath filled the room. No one moved. They were frozen, watching the blind king, waiting to see how the cripple would react. Seconds stretched into an eternity of silent disrespect. Ryu's hands, resting on the table, did not even twitch. He merely sat there, the unseeing sovereign in a court of cowards. It was then that a new sound broke the tableau, the soft, almost imperceptible rustle of a uniform. A figure detached itself from the shadows along the wall where the serving staff stood like statues. It was the new girl, an American, barely a woman at 18. Chloe. He remembered her from the hiring report, an orphan, brought to Japan by a now-defunct charity program, desperate for work. She was a ghost of a different sort, someone so far beneath the notice of men like Hideo and Goro that she was effectively invisible. She moved with a quiet grace that belied the tension choking the room, a simple dark blue dress and white apron her only armor. She held a clean white cloth in her hand. The other men at the table watched, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity, as she approached the head of the table. She didn't approach Hideo, the one who had spilled the wine. She walked directly to Ryu's side. She stopped, her presence a small, warm spot in the cold expanse of his feigned darkness. He could smell the faint, clean scent of laundry soap and starch from her uniform. "Oyabun," she said, her voice soft but clear, devoid of the pity or fear that laced everyone else's words. "Forgive the intrusion. There has been a spill." She didn't wait for a response. With practiced efficiency, she leaned forward, her arm moving carefully in front of him, and began to gently blot the wine from the table. Ryu, through the thinnest part of the silk over his right eye, watched her. She was the only one in 3 months who had dared to look him in the face, to speak to him as a man and not a monument to past glory. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, met his covered ones without flinching. Hideo finally broke his stupor, his voice slick with false concern. "My deepest apologies, Oyabun. I am a clumsy fool." He made to get up, to help, but Chloe was already finished. She straightened up, the stained cloth held discreetly in her hand. "It is clean now, sir," she said, her words directed only at Ryu. She gave a short, respectful bow and retreated as silently as she had come, melting back into the shadows by the wall. The moment was over, but a line had been drawn. Ryu hadn't moved a muscle, but in the silent, predatory calculus of his mind, every man at that table had been weighed, measured, and judged. Hideo's feigned deference was a clanging bell of betrayal. The others' inaction was a testament to their cowardice. But the girl was an anomaly, an unknown variable. In his world, anomalies were either threats to be eliminated or assets to be cultivated. He listened to the resumed, now stilted conversation, the sound of his own steady breathing and the distant, soft footfalls of the maid. Her courage was a single, pure note in a symphony of deceit, and Ryu, the master conductor, had heard it perfectly. He had found his canary. The question now was whether the mine was about to collapse on them both, or if she was the key to navigating the darkness he had created. He savored the irony. The one person who looked at his covered eyes was the only one who truly saw the man sitting there. The dinner concluded with the requisite bows and hollow pleasantries. As his lieutenants filed out, their whispers started before the heavy doors had even swung shut. "Did you see how she just walked up to him?" Masato's reedy voice was laced with disbelief. Goro grunted. "The foreign girl? She's got a death wish," then came Hideo's smooth, placating tone, the voice of a serpent coiling. "She is young and foolish. She does not understand our ways. I will have a word with the head of staff. It will not happen again." Ryu stood, gripping his cane. His hearing, honed by months of deprived sight, caught every syllable. "Our ways." Hideo spoke as if the ways of the Kageyama-gumi were now his to define. The arrogance was breathtaking. He felt a familiar, cold fury begin to smolder in his gut, but he banked it. Patience was the virtue of the hunter. He tapped his cane once, and a bodyguard, one he still half-trusted, materialized at his elbow to guide him. As he walked the long, silent corridors of his own home, he catalogued the changes. The scent of Hideo's expensive, cloying cologne lingered in the air long after he was gone. A priceless Edo period scroll had been moved from the main hall to the west wing, where Hideo had taken to holding his private meetings. Small things. The axe of a thief staking a claim before the owner was even in the grave. And through it all, there was the girl Chloe. She was now cleaning the foyer, polishing a silver statue of a dragon, her movements methodical and serene. As he passed, guided by his guard, she paused and bowed her head. "Good evening, Oyabun." It was simple, respectful. She did not offer pitying words about his condition. She did not scurry away. She simply acknowledged him. It was an act of profound normalcy in a world that had become a stage play, and it was more valuable than any declaration of loyalty. The next day, Ryu sat in his mahogany-paneled study, the black silk still tied around his eyes. The pretense was exhausting, but necessary. He had built his empire on the perception of unassailable strength. Now, he would rebuild it by exploiting the perception of absolute weakness. Hideo entered, his footsteps confident on the plush carpet. "Oyabun. The quarterly reports you asked for." He placed a heavy binder on the desk. "Masato has outdone himself. Profits are up 12% across our shipping ventures." Ryu ran a hand over the smooth leather of the binder. He didn't need to see the numbers. He had memorized the last 5 years of quarterly reports. He knew the rhythms of his business, the ebb and flow of every investment, better than he knew his own heartbeat. "Page 47, Ryu said, his voice flat. "The port fees for the Yokohama transfer. Masato lists them at 80 million yen. The government levy was increased last month, but only by 3%. The cost should be no more than 74 million." In silence, Ryu could almost feel the sweat beading on Hideo's brow. He had expected the blind man to simply accept the report, to grunt his approval while Hideo and Masato siphoned off the difference. "A clerical error, no doubt," Hideo said, his voice a fraction too tight. "I will have Masato corrected at once." "Your mind is as sharp as ever, Oyabun." It was a clumsy recovery. A lie wrapped in a compliment. Ryu gave a slight, dismissive wave of his hand. "See that you do." As Hideo retreated, flustered, Chloe entered bearing a tray with a single cup of sancha tea. She placed it on the corner of his desk, in the exact same spot she always did. He had noted her consistency. It was the mark of a disciplined mind. She moved to leave, but Ryu spoke. "Stay." She froze, her back to him. He heard the faint, nervous rustle of her apron. He had never asked her to stay before. This was a deviation, a test. He let the silence stretch, listening to her breathing, gauging her fear. She did not bolt. She did not make a sound. Finally, she turned to face him, her hands clasped respectfully in front of her. "Yes, Oyabun?" He gestured vaguely toward the window. "The cherry blossoms. Have they peaked yet?" It was a simple question, one a blind man might ask. But his covered eyes were locked on her face, analyzing every flicker of emotion. He was testing her honesty, her perception. Would she give a simple answer, or would she try to embellish, to placate him with what she thought he wanted to hear? She glanced at the window, her expression thoughtful. "They're close, sir. The trees by the koi pond are in full bloom, but the ones lining the main drive are still holding back a little. Another day or two of sun, and they will be perfect." It was a precise, observant answer. It was the truth. It was more than that. It was the answer of someone who sees, who pays attention to the world around them. He nodded slowly. "Thank you. You may go." As she left, her footsteps soft on the wood floor, Ryu allowed himself the smallest, most dangerous of feelings, a sliver of trust. Hideo had underestimated him, but that was expected. The greater danger was that Hideo was also underestimating the quiet girl who saw everything, and in doing so, he was placing a weapon into Ryu's hand that he didn't even know existed. The game was more complex than he had anticipated. Hideo's confidence, shaken by the incident with the financial reports, quickly rebounded, mutating into a more dangerous form of arrogance. He believed he had simply been caught on a minor error, a fluke of the old man's memory. He failed to see it as a warning. The following week, the changes in the mansion became more pronounced. Two of Ryu's personal guards, men who had served him for over 20 years, were reassigned. The official reason was a security restructuring to better protect the estate's perimeter. The truth, Ryu knew, was that they were being moved away from the heart of power. They were replaced by younger, brasher men, loyalists to Hideo, their faces stamped with a smug ambition. They walked with a swagger the old guards never would have dared. They spoke to Ryu with a strained, almost mocking, politeness. Ryu continued his performance, tapping his cane, needing a hand to guide him through the halls he could have navigated in total darkness. He was a lion in the dark, and the jackals were beginning to believe the stories of his demise. He spent his days in the study or the private garden, seemingly lost in thought, but his mind was a fortress of activity. He mapped Hideo's movements, his meetings, the new allegiances being forged in hushed tones in the West Wing. He was building a case, not for a court of law, but for a court of blood. During this time, Chloe's presence became a quiet constant. She brought his meals, his tea, and cleaned his study, always moving with the same unobtrusive grace. She never spoke unless spoken to, but he felt her eyes on him sometimes. It was not the pitying stare of the others, but a look of quiet, searching intelligence. One afternoon, as she was dusting the bookshelves, Ryu accidentally knocked a small, carved jade tiger from his desk. It wasn't a priceless artifact, but it held sentimental value, a gift from his own father when he first took his oath. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, a small piece chipping off the tail. The two new guards standing by the door snickered, a barely suppressed sound of contempt for the clumsy, blind boss. Chloe didn't hesitate. She was at his side in an instant, kneeling. She gathered the larger piece and then, with delicate fingers, found the tiny chip of jade on the dark wood floor. She stood and placed both pieces gently into his open palm. "It is a clean break, sir," she said, her voice low. "It can be repaired. It will be almost impossible to see the seam." She was not just reassuring him. She was offering a solution. She saw a problem and immediately sought to fix it. The guards saw weakness and mocked it. The contrast was stark. Ryu closed his hand around the cool jade. "Who is the best artisan in the city for this kind of work?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He already knew the answer, of course, but he wanted to hear what she would say. He was testing the depth of her knowledge, her resourcefulness. She thought for a moment. The old master Tanaka in the Ginza district is said to be the best, but he is very proud. He does not take new clients. However, his apprentice, a young woman named Emmy, is said to have a more delicate touch. She works from a small shop behind the fish market. Her work is quieter, but just as skilled. Ryu stored the information. She knew not just the obvious answer, but the better, more subtle one. She knew the hidden paths. "Thank you, Chloe," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. He felt her pause, a small, almost imperceptible hitch in her breath, before she bowed and resumed her work. That night, Ryu knew Hideo would be making his move soon. The jackal was done circling, and Ryu, the supposedly blind lion, was growing tired of the game. He had his weapon. Now he just needed to wait for the perfect moment to wield it. Chloe's duties often took her to every corner of the sprawling estate, a silent observer in a house of secrets. She polished the wood in the hallways where men plotted, she served drinks in rooms where loyalty was sold, and she cleared away the remnants of feasts where fortunes were decided. Her youth and her station made her invisible, a part of the furniture. They never considered that the furniture could listen. One evening, she was tasked with delivering fresh towels to the small washroom adjoining the West Wing's meeting room. The door was thick, but it was old, and it hadn't been closed properly. It was open just a crack, a sliver of darkness in the ornate frame. As she approached, she heard voices from within, low and urgent. Hideo's smooth baritone was unmistakable. He is a relic, a monument to a bygone era. He sits in that chair, sightless, useless, while our rivals in Osaka grow stronger every day. A gruffer voice, Goro's, rumbled in agreement. He caught you on the financials. The old fox still has teeth. He has memory, nothing more. Hideo's voice was sharp, cutting. A parrot can recite facts, Goro. It doesn't mean it understands them. He got lucky. It won't happen again. The time has come to put the clan's future in the hands of a man who can see it. Chloe froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The towels in her arms suddenly felt as heavy as lead. This was not idle gossip. This was treason. So, what's the plan? Goro asked, his voice dropping even lower. Friday, the night of the full moon. He performs his meditation ritual in the dojo. He dismisses his guards. He will be alone. Just him and his useless cane. We walk in, we pay our respects to the fallen Oyabun, and I take my rightful place. The others are with me. The few who are still loyal to him have been reassigned. It will be clean. A transfer of power. Chloe felt a cold dread wash over her. They were going to kill him. They were going to murder the man who, for all his terrifying reputation, had shown her more quiet dignity than anyone else in this house. The man who had asked about the cherry blossoms. The man who had thanked her by name. She backed away from the door, her movements as silent as a breath. Her mind raced. She had to warn him. But how? The guards at his door were Hideo's men now. If she tried to speak to him directly, they would stop her. They would report her to Hideo, and she would disappear. No one would even ask where the foreign maid had gone. She was trapped, a tiny cog in a giant, murderous machine. Fear, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her. She could just walk away. She could pretend she had heard nothing. She could pack her meager belongings and vanish into the Tokyo night, and no one would be the wiser. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing to do. But then she thought of Ryu, sitting alone in his study, the black silk over his eyes, a king unknowingly awaiting his executioners. She thought of his quiet dignity, the way he'd held the broken jade tiger. He was surrounded by betrayal, and she, the invisible maid, was the only one who knew the truth. Her fear was real, but something else was stronger. A fierce, unyielding sense of justice. They underestimated him. They all did. But they also underestimated her. She would not let them win. She clutched the towels to her chest, her knuckles white, and formulated a desperate plan. The next day, a palpable tension hung over the mansion. Hideo strode through the halls with the barely concealed swagger of a king-in-waiting, while the men loyal to him watched Ryu with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were all waiting for Friday. Ryu sat in his study, the picture of serene oblivion. When Chloe entered with his midday meal, her hands were steady, but her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She placed the tray on his desk, her movements precise and automatic. The two guards, Hideo's men, stood by the door, bored and arrogant. This was her only chance. She couldn't speak. She couldn't write a note. She had to use a language that only Ryu would understand, a language of memory and shared context. As she turned to leave, she stumbled, her elbow catching a tall, leather-bound book on the edge of the desk. It was a collection of classic Japanese literature, something she dusted every day. It fell to the floor with a heavy thud. "My apologies, Oyabun," she gasped, her voice filled with practiced panic. One of the guards snorted. "Clumsy girl." Chloe knelt to retrieve the book, her back to the guards, her face shielded from their view. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She opened it, pretending to check for damage. Her eyes scanned the table of contents, a list she had memorized last night. The Tale of the 47 Ronin. She quickly flipped to the chapter detailing the planning of the final assault. It described the night of the attack, the element of surprise, the betrayal from within. She stood, holding the book. "There is no damage, sir," she said, her voice still shaky. "But I was just reading the story. A silly thing to bring up. Forgive me." Ryu remained silent, his head tilted as if listening intently. "It's the story of the loyal retainers," she continued, her words quick and nervous, a performance for the guards. "They pretended to be drunk and disbanded, but they were just waiting. They waited for the coldest night, when their enemy's guard was down. They knew the layout of his mansion. They attacked when he was most vulnerable, during a private ceremony." She paused, took a deep breath, and delivered the final piece of the message. "The master of the house, he never saw it coming." She closed the book and placed it back on the desk, not in its original position, but directly in front of Ryu, its spine facing him. It was a blatant, almost reckless act. The guards exchanged a confused look, but dismissed it as the odd behavior of a flustered girl. Chloe bowed deeply. "I will be more careful, Oyabun." She turned and walked out of the room, her legs feeling like water. She did not look back. Had he understood? Was it too obscure? Or was it too obvious? Had she just signed her own death warrant? Inside the study, Ryu sat perfectly still for a full minute after she left. His fingers traced the embossed title on the book's spine. The 47 Ronin. A private ceremony. An attack from within. He never saw it coming. The irony was so thick he could taste it. She had not only warned him, she had told him that his own strategy, feigning weakness, was about to be used against him. She had used his own culture, his own history, as a weapon to defend him. She was more than a canary. She was a strategist. A slow, cold smile touched Ryu's lips beneath the silk cloth. The jackals had set their trap for Friday. But the lion was now awake. And he was hungry. He reached out and pressed a nearly invisible button on the underside of his desk, a silent alarm that bypassed the entire security system of the house and went directly to a single, old-fashioned pager worn by a man who had been waiting for this call for 3 long months. The game was over. The hunt was about to begin. The next 2 days were a masterclass in deception. To the outside world, Ryu was a man sinking deeper into his own darkness. He took his meals in his room, spoke to no one, and had his guards lead him on slow, shuffling walks through the garden. He was playing the part of a man defeated, allowing Hideo's narrative to take root. Hideo, for his part, was triumphant. He held court in the West Wing, accepting pledges of loyalty and outlining his vision for a new Kageyama-gumi, one free from the shackles of old traditions. He saw Ryu's withdrawal as the final collapse of a once great mind. He did not know that Ryu was using the time to wage a silent war. The old pager system, a relic from the 90s that Hideo's tech-savvy security team had deemed obsolete, was now Ryu's private line of communication. Short, coded messages, disguised as stock market updates, were sent to the 3 men Ryu still trusted above all others. These were not the polished thugs of Hideo's new guard, but grizzled veterans, men who had bled with Ryu in the past, whom Hideo had foolishly dismissed and sent to manage minor operations in the outer prefectures. The messages were simple. The dragon sleeps. The moon is full on Friday. Awaken him at the temple. They would understand. On Friday evening, the air in the mansion was thick with a predatory stillness. Chloe went about her duties, her face an unreadable mask of calm, but inside, her nerves were screaming. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every footstep sounded like a drumbeat of doom. She had done her part. The rest was in the hands of a man she hoped had understood her desperate warning. As dusk settled, Two of Hideo's guards came for Ryu. Oyabun, it is time for your meditation, they spoke with forced deference, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Ryu rose slowly, taking his cane. He allowed them to guide him towards the secluded dojo at the far end of the estate, a beautiful wooden building surrounded by a silent, manicured rock garden. He was the lamb being led to the slaughter. Chloe watched from a second-story window as they crossed the garden, a frail old man in black silk, flanked by his two executioners. Her heart ached with a terrible, helpless fear. She had gambled everything on him, and she was now just a spectator to the final act. The dojo doors slid shut, sealing Ryu inside. Inside, the dojo was lit by a single candle, its flame dancing on the polished floor. The room smelled of old wood and incense. "Leave me," Ryu commanded the guards. "I will call when I am finished," the guards bowed, a mocking gesture, and slid the doors shut, taking up positions outside. They believed they were standing guard. In reality, they were sealing the tomb. Ryu stood in the center of the room for a long moment, listening. He heard the guards outside murmuring to each other. He heard the wind rustling the bamboo in the garden. He heard the frantic beating of his own heart, a steady rhythm of controlled fury. Then, he reached up and, with a slow, deliberate movement, untied the black silk cloth from his eyes. He blinked once, twice, his pupils adjusting to the dim light. The eyes that had been hidden for 3 months were not the dull, vacant orbs of a blind man. They were the eyes of a hawk, sharp, clear, and blazing with a cold, lethal intelligence. He was not a lamb. He was a dragon in his own lair. And the hunters were about to become the hunted. He dropped the silk cloth to the floor and reached inside his kimono, his hand closing around the cool, reassuring steel grip of a pistol he had hidden there that morning. The door slid open. Hideo stood there, flanked by Goro and 3 other traders. They were smiling. "It is a sad duty, Oyabun," Hideo began, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "But your time is over," Ryu smiled back, a chilling, predatory baring of teeth. "My time," he said, his voice no longer the tired rasp of an old man but the sharp crack of a whip, "is just beginning." The moment stretched for a heartbeat, the smiles on the traders' faces freezing and then shattering like glass. Hideo's eyes widened in disbelief, his brain struggling to reconcile the image of the vital, seeing man before him with the helpless invalid of his imagination. It was in that split second of hesitation that Ryu acted. He didn't raise the pistol. That was too slow. Instead, he moved with a speed that defied his age, a blur of black silk and contained violence. He kicked a low wooden stool, sending it skittering across the floor to slam into the shins of the man on Goro's left, breaking his stance. In the same motion, he lunged forward, not at Hideo, but at Goro, the biggest threat. His hand, held rigid, struck Goro's throat in a precise, devastating blow. The brute choked, his eyes bulging as he clawed uselessly at his crushed windpipe. Before Goro's body even hit the floor, Ryu had drawn the pistol. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. 2 shots, fired without aiming, as if by instinct. The man whose shins had been broken fell with a hole in his chest. The man next to him crumpled, a look of stunned surprise on his face. 3 down in as many seconds. Hideo and the last 2 traders stared, paralyzed by the sudden, brutal reversal of their fortunes. The frail old man was gone, replaced by the demon of their legends. It was then that the dojo's other entrances slid open simultaneously. From the shadows of the garden emerged 3 figures, older men in simple dark suits, moving with the deadly economy of true professionals. Ryu's old guard. They held silenced pistols, and the remaining 2 traders were dispatched before they could even raise their own weapons. The room fell silent, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Only Hideo was left standing, his face pale, his ambition curdled into pure terror. He stared at Ryu, who stood untouched amidst the carnage, the smoking pistol held loosely at his side. You could see?" Hideo stammered, the question absurd in its simplicity. Ryu took a slow step forward, his eyes boring into his former second-in-command. I saw everything, Hideo. I saw your greed when you thought I was weak. I saw your ambition when you thought I was foolish. And I saw your betrayal when you thought I was blind. He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Hideo's heart. Hideo sank to his knees, his composure finally breaking. Please, Oyabun brother. Ryu's face was a mask of cold granite. You are no brother of mine, he paused, and his gaze flickered past Hideo, toward the main house. The only person in this house who showed me loyalty was a foreign girl who makes less in a year than you steal in a day. He looked back at Hideo, his eyes devoid of any emotion save for a chilling finality. She had the honor you so desperately lack. The shot was the last sound Hideo ever heard. Ryu stood over the body for a moment before turning to his loyalists. Clean this up. Leave no trace, the men bowed, their faces grim but resolute. Hi, Oyabun. Ryu walked out of the dojo, leaving the slaughter behind. He crossed the silent garden, his steps no longer measured by the tap of a cane, but powered by the confident stride of a king who had reclaimed his throne. He didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the warm light of the main house, where he knew Chloe would be waiting, unaware that her quiet courage had just fueled the cleansing of an empire. He found her in the main hall, standing by the silver dragon statue, methodically polishing a surface that already gleamed. Her hands were moving, but her posture was rigid with suspense. As his footsteps, unassisted and firm, echoed on the marble, she went still. She turned slowly, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of him. He was no longer the stooped figure of the past 3 months. He stood tall, his kimono immaculate, his face clear. And his eyes, no longer hidden, were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. The power dynamic in the room shifted, becoming a chasm. He was the Oyabun, the dragon, fresh from a kill. She was the Maid, a girl from another world who had stumbled into the heart of his. Fear, sharp and immediate, flickered in her expression. She had warned him, but she had also seen his weakness. In his world, witnesses were liabilities. She lowered her gaze, her hands clutching the polishing cloth. Oyabun, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He closed the distance between them, stopping just a few feet away. The scent of cordite and cold night air clung to him. Look at me, Chloe, he commanded. His voice was quiet, but it held the weight of absolute authority. Hesitantly, she lifted her head. Her dark eyes met his, and this time, she held his gaze. She saw no anger there, no threat. She saw a deep, penetrating intelligence and something else, something she couldn't name, a profound, almost weary, respect. You have a warrior's spirit in a servant's heart, he said, his voice a low rumble. A rare combination. He reached out, not with violence, but with a surprising gentleness, and took the polishing cloth from her trembling hands. He tossed it aside. Your days of polishing silver are over, she stared at him, confused and afraid. Sir, you see things others do not, he continued, his gaze unwavering. You see the truth behind the performance. Such a skill is wasted on dusting shelves. It belongs at my side. It was not a request. It was a decree. He was not offering her a promotion. He was claiming her as his own, an asset, a confidant, the one person who had proven worthy. The fear in her eyes was slowly replaced by a dawning understanding. He wasn't going to discard her. He was elevating her. The chasm between them remained, but a bridge was forming, woven from shared secrets and her singular act of courage. He was the dragon, and she was the one who had dared to look him in the eye and see the man, not the monster. And in his dark, violent world, that made her more valuable than any army. What happens when a predator feigns weakness? The scavengers grow bold, revealing the rot that hides in plain sight. But sometimes, in the darkest corners, a different kind of strength is revealed, not the strength of ambition, but the strength of integrity. Is true loyalty born from fear, or is it an act of courage that defies it? The blind king saw more than any of them, but it took the eyes of an outsider to show him where true honor resided. The game is over, but a new one has just begun. What did you think of Ryu's ruthless test and Chloe's quiet defiance? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of loyalty and betrayal, be sure to like, subscribe, and share for more tales from the shadows.